Brigitte Marshall. I'm the Director of School Services with SEEDS, which is a nonprofit that operates out of Berkeley. And we are a conflict transformation organization. We've been operating in the community for about 35 years. And we believe deeply in the power of dialogue, and that it is through dialogue that we build understanding. We do mediation, conflict resolution, and restorative practices in 3 different arenas: the community, in organizations, and in schools. And I oversee the work that we do in schools. And we've been working on supporting schools who are interested in implementing restorative practices for the last 6 or 7 years. And our model has changed over time as we have learned what works and what works less well. And we constantly iterate, and we are extremely responsive to the needs and respective starting points of each school that we work with. And if you are interested in pursuing implementation of restorative practices, I would be absolutely delighted to talk with you about what that could look like. And in fact, you're going to see a great deal of what it could look like in the course of today's presentation. So my goals for today is to have us think together about what's at stake for young people in our schools. And it's the experience of being in school that really interests and concerns us, and how the experience of being in school impacts the likelihood and the ability and the opportunity for young people to be successful, not just academically successful, but successful in all realms of what it means to be preparing for successful life. I'm going to share with you the foundational principles of restorative justice, and then talk about what it can look like to make the commitment to implement restorative justice in a school or in a district. And because restorative practices is at heart a relational concept, we're going to do some relationship building, because how could we not? We can't talk about restorative practices and not be committed to doing some relationship building as well. So the very first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to look around the room and identify someone who you have never met before. Perhaps at this conference you've seen them, but not a colleague, not someone you know, not someone you work with. And in just a second, I'm going to ask you to stand up, go find a partner, and once I see that everybody is partnered, I'm going to give you the next instructions. So look around, find someone you don't know, go partner with them. Does everyone have a partner? Ooh, it's very sharp. I am going to set the timer for 1 minute, and I'm going to invite you in 1 minute to discover as many things as you can about each other that you have in common. So 1 minute to identify as many things as possible that you have in common. Go!
We're both miscategorized today. What do you like to do for fun?
So I realized that I may not have stated one of the most important instructions, and that is that you were supposed to be counting how many things you had in common. Did anyone count? No. Yeah, how many did you get? 4. Any partnerships feel like you had more than 4? More than 5? More than 6? More than 7? 8? 9? 10? 11? All right, give them a round of applause. All right. Good inquiry. Now I'm going to invite each partnership to pair up with another partnership and form quads. Same thing. See if you can find a partnership that has people you don't know very well. Are we good? All right. Same thing. In 1 minute, find as many things as possible that all 4 of you have in common, and this time be sure to count. I will set the timer. Go. All right. 5 things in common or more? 5 or more? 6 or more? 7? 8? 9? Was it 9 here? 8. Anyone else have 8? Tell us what they are.
Well pets, we're all married, we've all been to New York, we all drink coffee, we all like to know how to ride a bike.
We all were teachers, and we all work in a school district.
All right. What can you share with us about the strategies you used to find that many things in common?
Ask some of the same questions we asked each other before.
So you used previous learning.
Yeah.
You brought previous learning as a strategy. What else did you do?
If it wasn't something shared in common, we just quickly move on. We didn't have a long conversation.
So you were very focused. You were task-oriented. It sounds like your categories were pretty broad, right? That felt like a good strategy. Let's give them a round of applause. You are in your new table groups. So the 4 that you are now with, that's who you're going to be sitting with. And it needs to be in one of the tables that is closest to me. So take just a minute to rearrange yourselves. If there are going to be empty tables, they need to be the tables at the back. So let's just do a super quick debrief of that activity. I call that an inclusive relationship building activity. Why do you think I call it that? What did you experience that was inclusive about it? Yeah. things in common as opposed to things that are different. Yes, everybody, as was demonstrated by 4 complete strangers, everybody can find something in common with someone else, particularly if you make your categories really super broad, right? We like to eat is one that I often hear. People figure out that there are some strategies. Why else did it feel inclusive?
We were breaking up the kind of the groups that we came in here with, so it didn't really matter how many connections you started with. Everybody made the same number of connections.
Right. The intention was to connect, and the intention was to connect with someone you don't already know, and that was really the only parameter. Yep. What else? It was quick. Yeah, didn't take a lot of setup, didn't need a lot of explanation, and even though I forgot one of the instructions, it still worked. I am a very, very strong proponent of keep it super simple. Often the simplest things are the most effective when we're committed to relationship building. So I'd love to just do a very quick go around the room to find out who is here. But I'm going to ask you to have a quick huddle at the table, and at your table you're going to go around in a clockwise direction and introduce each other. So our colleague here will introduce, what's your name? Kim. And it's simply going to be name and job title and where. So Brigitte, Director of School Services at Seeds, for example, if one of you was introducing me. So quick huddle at your table, know who you're going to be introducing, and then we'll go around the room and you'll introduce each other in turn. All right, can we have a table that would like to start? We're going to hear from everybody one by one. All right, so this table is going to start, and who is going to start? You're going to start? Can you say it a little bit louder?
Diane McEntee, and she is the Director of Education Services for
Union City?
Union School District.
Union School District. Thank you.
We got this strategy. She ended up telling me she went to elementary school at Oster, where I was a principal for 7 years, so it was just weird with that contract.
Connections.
Resource teacher, Santa Clara.
This is Kathleen Green. She's a special ed coordinator at Oak Grove.
Elk Grove?
Oak.
Oak Grove.
And then this is Shamar Edwards. She's a principal at Sunnydale Middle School.
Nice, thank you. Which table next? Okay.
This is Kim Chastain, and she's a program director in Modesto. This is Andrea Bailey, and she is a teacher from Diablo.
And this is Megan. She's instructional support teacher at Union School District.
Katie, she's a 7th grade teacher at Rolling Hills Middle School in Watsonville.
Great.
This is Steve. He's a 3rd grade teacher at Foster City School.
This is Kate. She's Director of Special Ed at Union School District.
She's a program specialist for psych. And this is Amy. She's a 6th grade teacher at Hopper.
Poirot, it's actually the same school, but Poirot Valley Union College.
All right.
Meet Lori. She is an education specialist in Palo Alto.
And this is Kristen. She's a instructional TOSA from Union School District.
This is Ashley, and she's an instructional TOSA in more detail.
Can you tell those of us who don't know what a TOSA is? Teacher on Special Assignment. Got it. Let's figure that out.
There it is.
Great. And this table?
This is Chalmers, she's an instructional teacher on special assignment.
This is Ember. She is the school climate
charge of learning and innovation at Union Center.
Very cool. And we're going to welcome our colleague who's joined us. Thank you. We're so glad you could join us, and we don't want you sitting at a table lonely by yourself. Come and join any table, yes. And you are?
My name is Colleen Toomey. I work at the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center, which does civil rights equity work. We're based out of Denver, but serve all of the West Coast.
Awesome. Great. So glad to have you here. Yeah, come join a table. We don't want anybody sitting off lonely by themselves. So, at your tables, and I will just say that something odd has happened to my fonts, and I tried to fix it, and it happened again. So you will see some strange fonts in the course of my slideshow today. And we've got the shadow already showing up. That's cool. At your tables, very quickly, what is justice? Quick huddle, quick conversation. What's the definition of justice? Anyone want to throw out a definition of justice? Call it out. I heard some conversation. I know you were saying something.
A reckoning.
A reckoning. A reckoning between right and wrong. What else? If you have justice, what do you have? Equity, fairness. Yep. Accessibility. Anything else come up in your conversations? Same kinds of ideas? So here's the dictionary definition. It's a concept that we use, as you know, in both an ethical context and in a legal context as well, that means people behave in a way that is fair, equal, and balanced for everyone. Fair, equal, and balanced for everyone. So here's a question for you. Are our schools just? Are they fair, equal, and balanced for everyone? Who most often does not experience our schools as fair, equal, and balanced places? Take 3 minutes in your table groups to chew on those two questions, and then we'll share out some ideas. No? Okay. Thank you. I just got going. So what came up in your table groups? Who most often does not experience our schools as fair and just places? Yeah.
We were all agreeing that primarily our special ed kids or kids of color that are being suspended the most, unfairly consequenced, and D's and F's, like, constantly.
And that was a shared observation. You have that experience in common. Is that true for other table groups? Any other additions? Yeah. Right, so the socioeconomic status and any other barriers to accessing the curriculum can also certainly impact the experience. Anything else? Hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Most often when we respond to this kind of question, we think about young people, as well we should. They're our priority, right? But it is adults who are serving our young people. And if we fail to think about whether our schools are experienced as just places for the adults in the system, then we've missed a really significant piece of what it will take to have everybody experience school in a way that serves our communities well. So here is what I call the moral imperative. We know that systematically the institution of education in California, in fact across the entire nation, is producing inequitable outcomes. And there are specific subgroups, almost all of which you have named, of students who experience school very differently from more privileged students. We named students with disabilities, students of color. Students who identify as LGBTQIA+ also are showing up disproportionately with some really negative impacts and effects. In addition to being more likely to be subject to school discipline, they are less likely to experience academic success. And by definition, if you experience school discipline more, you are more likely to be engaged in the criminal legal system. The ACLU has a stack of data that indicates, for example, that an individual who is suspended or expelled is exponentially more likely to be involved in the criminal legal system in the following year after their suspension or expulsion. And we know that that is often referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline, right? So there's a very clear correlation between discipline and on-ramp into the criminal legal system. Yeah?
Just heard people make the argument, and just to be clear, I'm not making it, I just don't know how to respond when I hear it. Well, if there's a correlation there because these kids, they have issues, and so of course the issues result in both discipline at school and legal trouble. So has the research actually shown causation that the act of disciplining these kids in the way that we currently are is pushing them into criminal activity?
I don't think that what is indicated is that it is pushing them into criminal activity. The correlation, I think, is that when students experience reduced success in school and are engaged in school less, the likelihood that they are then going to show up in the criminal legal system goes up. So it's not to say that it pushes them to engage in criminal acts. There's a whole bunch of people who engage in criminal acts who don't get caught, who don't get arrested. The correlation is students who are not thriving in school and not experiencing school as a place of personal power and agency, which makes them vulnerable to get caught up in the criminal legal system.
I guess what I'm pushing at a little bit is like, can we though make the convincing argument that changing these students' experience in school leads to different outcomes for them in the criminal system? And has that argument been convincingly made in the research?
Well, kids who stay in school are less likely to be involved in the criminal legal system, so yes.
Okay. I'm just
Am I
wondering-
missing a part of
Well,
the
I mean,
question?
again, you could say that's just correlation, right? So, like, have there been studies done, for example, where they take two groups, a randomized controlled trial, where there are two groups of kids, and one of them is disciplined differently, and the outcomes are then measured, which is different from saying kids who stay in, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I'm not wording it very well, but.
Yes, no, I do know what you're saying. To my knowledge, no. And I think there are several in the works. Does anybody else have information on that?
Well, I don't.
Everyone needs to use the mic,
I
otherwise
know,
it won't pick
yeah.
up the camera.
I just think it's more intersectional than that. I think there's multiple layers that are at play, right? Because if we think about socioeconomic class, right, and what kinds of resources our students have and what they might be navigating at home, and do they have enough to eat, and do they have, are they working a job because they have to help provide for their family? That might be taking them out of school too, and thus this like almost a target is put on their back because they're not. I just think it's more layered than just the discipline. It's like what causes that, right? The identities we hold and the things we have to carry inform some of this too.
Yes, thank you very much. It is extremely complex. I do think that we are hungry for comprehensive research to support the contention that many of us are making around why it makes sense to implement restorative practices and restorative justice. It's not just as an alternative to traditional discipline. That's certainly one of the reasons to do so. And there are others. And I do think that because this is still relatively new, there isn't a long research base, a long history of a research base, and we need one. Thank you for raising such an excellent and complicated question. So here is a concept that I want to introduce for us to think about. I have a graphic to represent this. The physical disengagement of students is very obvious, right? When they are not in the classroom, when they are physically removed from the classroom, they are physically excluded from their opportunity to learn. They are not participating in the educational process. And that's clear, straightforward, it's obvious. And there's been a lot of focus and attention paid to suspension and expulsion. There's a lot of recent legislation in many different states, including California, that prescribes certain actions that have to take place before a student is suspended. So you have to engage in all sorts of what else could we possibly do now. Many schools have been told by their districts, you have to reduce your suspension rates. Well, it's pretty easy to reduce suspension rates. You just stop suspending kids. But that doesn't necessarily mean that kids are effectively and appropriately engaged, and it doesn't necessarily mean that what is happening instead of suspension is serving them any better than when the outcome for behavioral harm was suspension and expulsion. So we like to pay attention to the relational disengagement, because just because you're not suspending and you're interrupting the school-to-prison pipeline escalator by not suspending, that's good. Don't get me wrong. I'm delighted that the suspension and expulsion rates have come down very, very sharply in recent years. But unless we pay attention to what's happening lower down on the escalator, we're not necessarily serving students any better. And there are other ways of falling out or being pushed out. There are other ways of being excluded. And some of those impacts are right here. So you could experience in-school isolation, in-classroom separation. You could be sent out of the classroom, office referrals, in-school suspension. This is the sort of typical trajectory that we often think about, right? And this is what we recognize as the school-to-prison pipeline, the push-out as it has been described. But students can fall off and fall out even though they are physically present. And I have seen many students who are physically present in classrooms, but they are not relationally engaged. So there is still a level of exclusion that is occurring, that is their experience in education, even though they've not been subjected to traditional discipline. So it's a little more complicated and a little more nuanced than just we need to stop suspending kids because that sets them up for involvement in the legal system. Yes, we know that's true, but that's not the end of the story. We have to pay deep, deep attention to what is going on inside our schools and inside our classrooms. And that is, what are we doing when harm has occurred? How are we responding? But it's also, how are we making sure that we're preventing in-classroom isolation and in-school isolation? Many of you are probably aware of the epidemic of anxiety that is sweeping through this generation of young people. It is really alarming. We're seeing younger and younger and younger children. I heard a program on NPR last week about the increase in the suicide rate of children as young as 10 in the last few years. So our young people are experiencing an onslaught of other kinds of impacts that can result in their exclusion from their opportunity to learn. So this is another route that could potentially propel them into the school-to-prison pipeline that at SEEDS we believe we have to pay really deep attention to. It's the relational engagement that we need to be focused on, not just not suspending kids. Oh. What kinds of policies and practices in your schools contribute to the relational disengagement of students? So before I turn you over to table groups, let's just popcorn a couple to get our thinking going. What kinds of policies and practices can contribute to relational disengagement? Yeah.
In our district, teachers are allowed to classroom suspend.
And what does that look like?
It means the child has to be out of their classroom. So once again, they're in the office or a different setting, but again, they're removed from their peers in the instruction. So they have that option.
Right, that's a perfect example. So in your table groups, you're mixed up, you come from different schools, different districts. Compare notes. What are the policies and practices that are currently in play in your schools and your districts that can contribute to the relational disengagement of students? Take a few minutes. I'd love to hear a little bit about your conversations. What kinds of policies and practices did you name that you're experiencing as contributing to the relational disengagement of young people in your schools? Any table want to share out a little bit? Yeah, thank you.
At lunchtime, if someone's being particularly disruptive, there's like a table in the back or at the side that they're usually pulled and sent to stop the disruption and eat in peace, so to speak. It just takes them away from their friends.
So they are physically separated from an opportunity for social interaction as a result of behavior that is experienced as disruptive or inappropriate.
Right.
Yeah. Some others? I love how it goes really, really quiet. You had these amazingly animated conversations in your table groups, and now suddenly no one's got anything to say. I know, it feels a little artificial, doesn't it? I know.
We were kind of talking about curriculum and sharing different opinions about the curriculum that we're using and how it meets equity needs and things like that. We had lots of opinions, but also right at the end, benching students at recess and feeling like principals often don't have an alternative menu or selection or restorative practices or things to like help grow or reteach or repair. It's just sit on the bench, and that's not a very productive use of a kid's time.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? When we have a combination of, well, that's kind of the way it's always been done, and that was what we experienced, so you just kind of repeat and perpetuate, and what other options do I have? And what other resources do I have? Sometimes I think we lean into some of these practices out of, what else can I do? Yeah, it's a great point.
And we talked about that a little bit too, about really balancing if a kid is being so disruptive in a classroom, like balancing, okay, did that one kid miss out on his learning, or do we continue to kind of stop the learning for all the others? But then we also talked about, well, if it does come to that and a student is out of the classroom, their reintegration for the student back into the classroom isn't happening. And so there's not like that relational repair between the teacher and that student when they come back. So then it's just going to
Beautiful. Yeah. So even if there's a commitment to minimize the amount of time that a student is removed from their opportunity to learn, if we're not thoughtful and really intentional about how we're bringing them back in, then that relational disengagement is at risk of being continued and maybe even amplified. They're back but shunned, or they're back but they don't know what's going on anymore. Yeah, great point. A couple more? Yeah.
I think even just the setup of a school schedule, and having, no kind of consideration of the time or where a child is at when they get to school emotionally or physically, if they're hungry, all of those things, or if they are engaged in a task and they want to continue that task, but the bell rings and they have to get to the other class or the other transition. So just, the entire setup.
Yeah, sometimes the structure and the schedule of school results in relational disengagement. Yeah.
Just to build on what was said, I think it's too many people in our system being asked to be superhuman and be superheroes. And so, I put my cape on every day and happy to do it, but it's not sustainable. And when you're asking, if there are 60 people in your building and 10 people have their capes on and the other 50 don't, there's going to be a lot of relational disengagement.
Yep. Education is hard. It's hard work, and it's exhausting work, and it's highly emotional and high concentration, right? You can't turn off. If you're in a classroom with young people, you can't just check out for a while. You're on all the time, and that is super, super exhausting. Yeah, we're asking a lot of educators. So I really want us to humanize this question. So I'm going to invite you to talk about students you know, not necessarily by name. We've talked about groups of students we know are vulnerable. Students of color, students with disabilities, students who identify as LGBTQIA+. I want you to think very particularly about young people you know who you feel are vulnerable to relational disengagement, and spend just a couple of minutes sharing at your table so that we can anchor our thinking in the experience of real young people. So just take a couple of minutes. So We have brought the young people who we care about into the room and into our consideration, and I want you to hold them in mind as we continue our conversations. Here's just a few things that often are named by educators. That was funny. Mispronunciation. I didn't plan that. Mispronunciation of students' names. We've talked about inability to access the curriculum for sure. Refusal to use chosen pronouns. Literature that doesn't reflect students. Students don't see themselves in the literature that's available to them in the classroom. Zero tolerance discipline policies, for sure. Absence of teachers who look like students. How many of you teach in schools where the teaching force looks very different from the student body? Quick to scold, slow to praise. Schools or classrooms that are all about, this is the way it needs to be. Shutdowns, put-downs, invisibilizing. The favorite one that I remember from the way I was raised is when I would say in front of my mother, I really like something, something, and she would say, don't be so silly, no you don't. Oh, I thought I did. Right, that's a way of invisibilizing. It's a way of negating thoughts and feelings and devaluing thoughts and feelings. We've talked about socioeconomic disparities. And then, of course, there's the big one, unconscious bias, right, which results in microaggressions. And there is absolutely no question that if we're going to do really deep thinking and work around relational engagement, we have to take on unconscious bias at some point. Okay, so just a couple of minutes. Let's start thinking about, we've named what is often true in schools. What are some things that your school, district, classroom could do to reduce relational disengagement of students? And I want a rapid fire 1 minute round the table. Just shout out an answer in your table groups. 1 minute, I'm going to set the timer. All right, super fast. We're going to popcorn around. In a couple of words, what are some things that your school or district could do? Anyone? Yell it out, super loud. Training and support for teachers.
Emotionally responsive caregiving and teaching.
Beautiful. Emotionally responsive caregiving and teaching. Family and community involvement and engagement. Yeah, let's bring the families in. Not that you're not doing that already, but yes. Holding adults accountable. Yep, what else? All right, well, let me tell you what I think. Prioritizing relationships. The Search Institute, I did bring a few things, and I did upload this to the site as well, and you can get it. But if you want to take one of these, the Search Institute has done this beautiful breakdown of relationship-based practices that are absolutely key to the relational engagement of young people. If anybody would like to have one of those. Can I have a volunteer to read this, please, in an extremely loud voice?
Young people are more likely to grow up successfully when they experience developmental relationships with important people in their lives. Developmental relationships are close connections through which young people discover who they are, cultivate ability to shape their own lives, and learn how to engage with and contribute to the world around
You all knew that, right? We know relationships are key in education. The question becomes, how do you operationalize that? We know relationships are critically important in the experience of education, but how do you operationalize prioritizing relationships? We know what's at stake. We know that if we don't do that, we know what can happen. So my answer is implement restorative practices with a view to achieving restorative justice. So remember, our definition of justice was fair and equal experiences for all. So what would restorative justice mean? And I want to pause here and just note and very, very humbly acknowledge that we are borrowing practices from ancient civilizations who have been exercising these practices for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I think it's critically important to acknowledge that we are borrowing, co-opting, benefiting from practices that many colonial powers attempted to beat out of communities and civilizations. And there are multiple different examples: the First Nations of Canada and the United States, the Maori in New Zealand, and many, many African tribes and civilizations of people have examples of practices that we would describe as restorative. So there's a rich repository for us to draw on and to think about how we can modify and adapt and bring these practices into our own situations. So here is the definition of restorative justice. It's a very big umbrella term, and there are two very significant components to it. One is community building, and the other is response to harm. And what I would emphasize is that you cannot attempt the response to harm aspects of restorative justice if you have not done the community building. It's actually a prerequisite. You have to build the social capital that you need in order to be able to lean into this different response to harm. We are seeking to repair harm, which means restoring relationships and creating these safe and inclusive spaces for dialogue. And there are four fundamental key concepts. One is that when harm occurs, we recognize that it impacts the immediate relationship and the larger community. If you think about a fight that happens in the classroom between two students, clearly two students are impacted. So is the teacher. So are the students who saw the fight. Perhaps a school security officer, perhaps the counselor, perhaps the principal, the families. There's all sorts of other people who are also impacted. And when we're committed to operating in a restorative way, we're remembering all of the ripple effects and all of the other people who are impacted. Another key concept in restorative practices and restorative justice is that those who have been harmed are involved in the resolution. And the resolution needs to be to their satisfaction. I made a commitment to be a restorative practitioner 4 years ago, and it has drastically, dramatically changed the way I parent and the way I am a friend. This is not something we do to people, it's a commitment to show up in a certain way. I have 2 grown young people of my own, and I have a 15-year-old still at home. Sorry, kids who've already left. Really wish that I'd seen the light before. My 15-year-old, I engage restoratively with him. When he does all of the developmentally appropriate numbskull bonehead things that he is pre-programmed to do, which he does on a regular basis, normal kid, we go through restorative processes. And I ask him, what do you think you need to do to make things right? And he always says, please don't take away baseball, please don't take away my phone. And I say, what do you think you need to do to make things right? And he'll suggest something. And if it doesn't work for me, I say, no, that doesn't work for me. Recognizing that in order for the harm to be healed, it needs to be to my satisfaction. It's a way of being. Yes, it's not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's not an initiative, it's a commitment. A commitment. So we talked about according to the needs of those harmed. There's a fundamental premise, and I apologize again for the multiple changes in font. It's throwing me off a little bit. That's not the way I designed it. When we are in relationship with people, it's harder to do them harm. When you know someone, it is harder to do them harm. And it's easier to take accountability if harm does occur. It's a fundamental belief that undergirds restorative justice, which is why we put so much emphasis on relationship building. Because when we know each other, much harder to be rude or inconsiderate or cruel or unkind. So when we have certain kinds of behaviors that we would like to see change in a school community, our first recommendation would be engage in relationship building, engage in community building. So the fundamental questions in a traditional punitive style approach is, what rule or law was broken, who broke it, and what's the punishment? Boom, boom, boom. If we make a commitment to a restorative approach, we first ask what harm was caused and to whom, remembering the ripple effects, not just the immediate people in the situation. What needs have arisen, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So if we wanted to shift from this traditional approach to a restorative approach, what do you think of the pros and cons? Shoulder partner conversations. Turn to someone at your table very quickly. What do you think are the pros and cons of a shift from rules to relationships? Pros and cons. Anyone? Yeah. Microphone's coming.
When you describe doing this with your son, because I have teenage boys, how do you, or have you ever experienced a situation where he feels like he's just having to sort of guess what you want him to say, right? So you say, what do you think needs to be done to make this right? He proposes something, and you're saying that the way this works is that the one harmed then has the opportunity to say whether that's acceptable to them or not. And I can see a lot of kids not really wanting to engage in a process like that because they're feeling like there's a right answer here and they're being forced to figure it out.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, I mean, this is a con, is that, or can be experienced as a con, I don't think it is, but there isn't a clear-cut consequence, right? Because each situation is very specific and particular, and so the consequences are also particular. For example, I have shifted from saying, if you do something wrong, you get your phone taken away. And it didn't really matter what the wrong was. I used to have this thing, you lose a privilege, right? And it was black and white, it was clear cut. I don't do that anymore. When he does something that isn't okay, we talk it through, we think it through, and we craft a set of consequences that are as responsive to what he did as possible. So it takes longer because we have to figure out what's appropriate, what makes sense. My point was that how I feel about the situation is something that is taken into consideration. So if it was a situation between two young people and someone had caused some harm to another one, the one who had been caused harm will have an opportunity in a restorative process to say, that doesn't really help me feel better about this. And to say, I think it would make me feel better if, with help, with support. Yeah.
My question is, and I teach 6th grade, so one true example is a student called another student a name. So in deciding how to address the student who called her a name, at what point do I recruit the harmed student's opinion? Is it a 3-person conversation where she then may be feeling pressure from the person who's calling her names, like don't get me in trouble? Or is it 2 separate conversations the teacher's having with the children and then coming back and going back and forth?
Yes, it's all of those. So we're getting in a little deep, but it's a really great question. So one of the very first things to say is that a restorative process is always voluntary. So if the person who's caused harm is not willing to take accountability and participate in it, that just is what it is. If the person who has been harmed says, I'm not feeling it, no, that's not comfortable, I don't want to do that, then it doesn't happen. When it does happen, or even if it doesn't happen, you're going to have individual conversations with each person. So the person who has been harmed, you can go through a set of restorative questions and say, what happened, what were you thinking and feeling, how were you impacted, what have you been thinking since, what do you think needs to happen to make things as right as possible. You can have that one-to-one conversation with the person who's been harmed, and you can have the one-to-one conversation with the person who did the harm, and then you make an assessment about whether you're going to bring the 2 of them together and do a harm circle of sorts. And I go back to what I said, that relationship building is a prerequisite. So if you haven't done community building, if you haven't done deep relationship building, the likelihood of that kind of harm response being effective is much diminished. So let's stay focused on the question, pros and cons. What else came up for folks?
I think the pros are that you're actually addressing the underlying behavior. You're working through it. I think the con is that it is more time consuming.
Yes. So the time thing comes up a lot. The thing that is attractive about the rule approach is it's pretty efficient, right? At least at first blush, we think it's pretty efficient. It's clean, it's clear, everybody knows, you break the rule, you get a punishment, moving right along. But it does very little to address the underlying behavior, the cause, the reason why it's happening, and it does very little to contribute toward prevention. So although this is time consuming, it's deeply relational, so it's lots of talking, it's lots of engagement. We firmly believe that that investment is worthwhile because there is greater likelihood that you can contribute to preventing the behavior from repeating. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Yeah.
The restorative justice, though, provides that pro of growth mindset that you can fail. I'm a stupid 6th grader. I made this mistake. I didn't know that this was going to cause that person harm, emotional harm, even with the name said. I just said it because they're impulsive, right? At middle school sometimes, whether or not, and that gives them a chance to say, oh, this is why I probably wouldn't do it again instead of, so.
Yeah.
Failure is okay.
Beautiful point. Yes. And we're really leaning into developing empathy. Like, I want you to understand that harm was caused. A punishment does none of that, right? It's like, just give me my punishment, let's get on with it. You know, I've heard that. It's like, okay, yeah, all right, you caught me, I broke the rule, give me my punishment, whatever. But when we have an emphasis on what needs have arisen from the situation, we're really inviting empathetic awareness and an understanding. And kids need to make mistakes, right? It's not the mistake that's the problem. It's whether or not they learn from it and whether or not they grow and develop as a result of making the mistakes. Okay, so this is what I was getting at earlier also. You asked for a clarification. Restorative justice is not something we do to kids. It's a state that we are seeking to achieve. We want restorative justice to prevail in our schools. So we want things to be fair and equal, and we want them to be restorative, meaning we're going to prioritize relationships. And there are three things that we believe need to happen. We call it the trifecta of restorative justice. And it's represented here. For sure, implementing restorative practices, community building, relationship building, using restorative language, being inclusive, etc. Additionally, we need trauma-informed practices. We need to anchor ourselves in what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you. Why did you do that? Curiosity, what happened to you? Student comes into the classroom, kicks a desk, throws their backpack down, shoves somebody's book off a desk. Our natural inclination might be to say, get out of my classroom and come back in properly. You know better than that. A restorative invitation would be, I wonder what happened to that young person. Something must have happened. I wonder what they're feeling. Yeah.
You often think of the person who caused harm as going to be, oh, he's the bad kid, or you know what it means. So
Absolutely.
It's like you have to have positive presuppositions that like, why did you make this decision, and like, did you miss breakfast this morning? Did your mom yell at you? You know, so
Absolutely.
distress at home.
Yes. I don't believe that young people wake up in the morning and the first thought in their head is, I'm going to be an absolute pill at school today. I'm going to piss my teacher off. I just don't believe that that's the way young people roll, particularly preteens and teens. They're not doing a whole lot of thinking other than impulsive. You know, we know their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed yet. Their reasoning around behavior is still in formation mode. There are behaviors, there are actions that impact people, and to presuppose that there was ill intent does a massive disservice. So, beautiful comment. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You know, we're assuming students are in a sober state. And so I am really right now kind of talking about the exception to the rule, not really the rule, because I think this works 90% of the time. But when we're dealing with students who have chronic issues and you've done some of these, you know, you've laid down these foundational pieces, it's your approach, it's your mental state of how you want to address. But at least what I've been dealing with lately is students who are, you know, vaping, smoking, getting high, parents don't know what to do. I mean, we've tried to activate the community, the school is under-resourced, you know, and we're schools, you know, we're not therapy centers, and so it's like, where does those things connect? So how do we restore, and it's like beyond us, beyond our capacity.
Yeah, this is another epidemic, right? Unfortunately, it's often not the exception. There's so many young people who are accessing substances that are messing with their brains at a time when it's really critical. They're still developing. And we don't know a lot about it, right? The research base is very, very small because it's so recently legalized. So it feels very, very concerning to me. I still believe that a commitment to show up restoratively is the right thing to do, and that there are consequences that we can name that lean into a consideration of harm. I know lots of educators are inviting students who have been using substances to do research on the impact, to invite speakers to come to the school, and the consequences something to do with learning about the game that you're playing here and what you're messing with, and want to deeply acknowledge the added complication and challenge that that brings. Yeah.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to add one more thing about what you said. You talked about the brain and the brain developing in that crucial time. And I don't know if anyone else just went to the workshop right before, the trauma-informed practices for early childhood. But I think on your session, it was like I think it's kind of a nice, this is the how-to. So the one right before it was the trauma-informed practices, and there's a book by Julie Kurtz, and there's 2 other authors on it that talks about the brain, and it talks about basically talks about behaviors, looking at behaviors not as what's wrong with you, but what happened to you, talking about and really addressing when you have behaviors in the classroom, instead of sending them to the office, get out of my classroom, it's what happened to you. Let's and another training I have seen where you can do restorative, and I'm sure you're going to get to it, restorative circles, restorative justice circles, and getting the whole class involved to bring that child who was sent out, bringing him back into community, and really having, so I'm sure you're going to get to it, or maybe not.
Absolutely,
but
yeah. And that's
it's
that's why we name trauma-informed practices as part of the trifecta necessary to achieve restorative justice. You have to hold yourself, we believe, in this place of curiosity about what's going on for young people. And then, of course, addressing the impact of power and privilege on marginalized identities. Many of you in your school districts have departments of equity and inclusion now, which is fabulous. All of these things are intertwined, right? We will not be able to address what we know are disparate impacts on young people if we're not prepared to take on these issues. So it is part of what a school community would need to be concerned with. These essentially are the goals for restorative justice in schools. You'll notice that the first 3 are all around culture and climate, with a view to interrupting relational disengagement, as we named, creating alternatives to suspension and expulsion for sure, and then addressing the disproportionality. So we are setting up a completely different construct and a completely different set of assumptions about the way young people roll and the way we need to respond. We like to see behaviors as unmet needs. We like to see behaviors as messages. And what's confounding is that sometimes the message comes to us in a language that we don't understand. Like, what the heck? Where is that behavior coming from? It doesn't appear to make logical sense. And the challenge for educators is that in the moment, you don't necessarily have time or all the information that you need to figure it out, which is why I recommend being in community as adults in a school, so that you can say, what do you think's going on with this young person? Here's what happened. They said this, she said that, he said that, and then they did this. I have no idea what's going on. And call in the wisdom of your school community. Also, relationally, we know that some young people connect with some adults better than others. And that's okay. Don't take it personally. Call on the wisdom of others in your community. And my invitation around a reframe, how many of your schools have practices of identifying students who are on a watch list or on an academic concern list or a performance? And so at the beginning of the school year, you might have conversations about, oh yes, you need to keep an eye on him. Oh yes, she's likely to. And without realizing it, we can be at risk of stigmatizing certain young people. Our invitation, if you're taking a restorative approach, is to reframe that and say, here are some strategies I found really effective with this young person. So you center it around your practice rather than the deficiencies or the bad behavior of the young person. Behaviors are messages, they're unmet needs. And we have the benefit of education and training to allow us to figure out how we're going to respond to those unmet needs, collaboratively and together. So here is what implementation looks like over time. Very similar to multi-tiered systems of support, right? We have tier 1 practices that you do with everybody all the time. And that's the community building and the relationship building. That's where and how you build the social capital that would allow you to get to the tier 2 and tier 3 practices, which are the harm circles. I will never recommend to a school community that they start using harm circles, which is what most people associate with restorative justice, unless and until they've spent a significant amount of time doing the relationship building and the community building. And that's still circle practice. Community building circles are a beautiful manifestation of restorative justice. And it's all about connection, connection, connection to connection. And the simplest prompts, I experienced a beautiful one in a school in San Jose a couple of weeks ago. It was a check-in prompt, and it was, if you could go anywhere in the world, where would it be? Right, simple, low stakes, not too deep. And a young person said, I would go to Oregon because that's where my brother is and I haven't seen him in 4 years. And several students in the circle were clearly very impacted. Oh, so now we know you have a brother you haven't seen in 4 years. Whew, heart connection. So the practice of community building circles creates that web of connection that feeds preventative behaviors. When I'm connected to you, when I'm in relationship to you, it's harder to do you harm. Now I know that your granny is sick. I might think twice about stealing your lunch money. I don't know. So we really want to focus on this relationship building, community building aspect at the beginning. And once we've built all of this social capital, then we can think about building out practices at tier 2 and tier 3 level. Do just want to point out this. As a school community, if you're going to think about implementing restorative practices because you want to achieve restorative justice, if at the end of the first year you're feeling like you're not getting traction, don't be surprised. It's a long-term commitment. As with anything in education, we should not expect to see massive shift and change any shorter than 3 years. And in order for it to really, really get established and start to be a part of the way a school community is, I would expect to need a very consistent commitment for 5 years. And here is what it can look like. This is absolutely not a cast iron blueprint, but these are the kinds of things that we would invite a school community to do during the first year. Getting clear about what is the current state of our culture and climate. Are we essentially a kind and caring school community, or do we have a bullying issue? Do we have a teasing issue? We know that those kinds of things can kind of grow legs and run away, right? And there's a shift in school culture often from year to year. Looking at school and district policies and practices, for example, dress code, homework, grading. And that is just to be clear, to understand. So what is true in our school community around these things, and what relational impact do they have? To what extent are they undermining strong and healthy relationships or supporting them? And then looking at what else you are doing, multi-tiered systems of support, PBIS, SEL, restorative practices, they have a lot of synergy and connection. But it's important to be super intentional about how these things all fit together. And you don't want a community of educators to experience, here we go, one more thing. You know, we just implemented this new SEL curriculum and now they're starting on about the restorative practices stuff. So spending the first year thinking deeply about oh, we're already talking about that with our SEL work. So you just leverage that a little bit so that educators don't experience RP or RJ as another thing that they have to think about implementing. Talking about it a lot, engaging families. You never want a family's first exposure to RJ to be when their student has done something, or when a student has done something to their student. Developing a plan and focus on tier 1, community building, relationship building. And there are the tier 1 practices. Community building, circle practices, lots, all the time, everywhere, build connection. And then we do work around restorative language, using invitational language rather than challenging, ordering, arguing, threatening, shaming, things that we might need to heighten our awareness of around the way we just speak in schools. And then year 2, here's a recommendation of what we think can be a good focus. And in tier 2, year 2, you might start training on the tier 2 and tier 3 practices. That's harm circles, circles of support and accountability, re-entry circles if students are coming back from suspension, for example. So we've done lots of anchoring, culture, community building, and only as we get deep into year 2 do we start training on the tier 2 and 3 practices. And then we keep circling back around. How are we doing? How's it going? Do we have circles happening in classrooms across the whole school? Do we have new staff? How do we bring them on board? It's this constant looping. And then getting into the practice of training staff in restorative practices before the school year begins, and scheduling top-up training throughout the year, and providing opportunities to bring problems of practice. I was doing circles in my classroom, but they kept dissolving and disintegrating into bad behavior, and now I just don't know what to do. Educators need time to chew over those things together and to think together about how to bring the practices to life. And this is essentially the roadmap. This is implementation over time. Start here and then build into these practices. But first and foremost, community building, relationship building, absolutely critical. That is it as an introduction, and the intent is to give you a sense of what it can look like and why we make the invitation to schools to think about operating in this particular way. It's not an initiative, it's not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's a commitment. And if a school community says, we think this would be good for our young people and our families and our community of educators, Seeds would be more than happy to support you to think about what it could look like in your particular school community. So I encourage you to reach out. We're doing a lot of work in Santa Clara County with a few different schools, and would love to be engaged with your school. Yeah?
Have any kind of online? Does Seeds have any kind of online training for a teacher where like I could go and just do like a PD online or do you recommend anything?
Not yet.
Okay.
We would love to develop it. It's actually in my work plan for this year to start that development. We do public trainings a couple of times a year. So if you look on our website, I'm not sure if they're up yet, but they will be shortly. And those are typically 3-day trainings for the intro to RJ. But we do come to schools. And I have business cards here if anybody would like to take one.
We're in the process of trying to get a needs assessment designed for BUSD. Do you have samples of the school climate assessment, or like do you have samples of those that you've made, or?
Yeah, we have not designed one, again, because we don't want to have schools feel like, oh, now we have to do this. Our encouragement is to get information from whatever it is a school is already doing or a district is already doing. The Healthy Kids Survey, you can glean a lot of information from that. What are other schools or districts doing with regard to culture and climate assessments?
We look at our PBIS data, and it's not a comprehensive view, but it helped us break down, like, okay, we're seeing a lot of problems between 8 and 9 in the morning. That's when they first come. And then we looked at the notes written on citations, what seems to be the biggest behavior. So it's not totally comprehensive, but it is a good little lens.
Anyone else can recommend a good culture and climate assessment? It's a need. Yeah. Thank you all very much. I don't want to keep you. I want to finish on time. And please do take a business card if you would like one.